Brad Johnson, former CIA operations director. Welcome to America Daily.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. And I was an operations officer, not director. That's a substantially higher position I would love to take credit for, but cannot.
Okay, well, I'm sorry for the mistake, but thank you for correcting that.
Okay.
So let's start by having you tell our listeners as much as you can what the CIA Directorate of Operations is and generally what kind of cases does it handle?
Sure. Now, there's a long tradition of CIA operations, or human intelligence, human operations, which is the espionage arm, if you will, of the United States government. And that began with OSS during World War II, where we discovered that we desperately needed to know the information that was going on, what the enemy's plans and intentions were. And in fact, intelligence played a pivotal role in World War II. So the overall importance of it was recognized. And following World War II, a few years later, building on OSS, they created the CIA as a civilian agency, a non-military arm of the government, if you will. So the operations was built strictly on that. By operations, it's referring specifically to espionage. And now there's a little mission creep, and there's some other factors that are built in naturally, but that's it. So it's the traditional terms for the spotting, assessing, and eventual recruitment of reporting sources or reporting assets that could tell the United States government secrets, the things that they did not want us to know. Specifically, one of the famous examples given is with overhead photography, like satellite photography of the ground. You can see that X country has driven 500 tanks up to the border, but what are they going to do with them? Is it a training exercise? Or are they going over tomorrow morning at dawn? And so that's there is no replacement for human intelligence, because that's somebody who can tell you what are they going to do with those tanks. Are they just there for training, or what will be the purpose of them? So it's overseas postings most commonly, although there's other ways too, and people are out overseas mixing and mingling and so on. And that was the job of the operations officer traditionally out of the CIA. So that's the espionage aspect of it. Although the CIA is huge, it's a big organization. I compare it to the Air Force as a fairly close comparison. You know, you have pilots that fly aircraft, and the basic duty of the principal duty of the Air Force is to put aircraft in the air, whether remotely or piloted. It doesn't matter. They're to put airplanes in the air. And I would say it's a very similar situation with the CIA. It's to put operations officer out in the field. Now, a very important change that took place under the Obama administration, the previous administration, was John Brennan, the former director of the CIA. And what he did was he disbanded, got rid of operations. So it's a devastating blow to our capabilities to have that disbanded. He did what he called this is out in the public arena so we can discuss it, but he disbanded the operations aspect and called this the modernization. Now, what he did do was bring in a lot of technical collection means and things like that, where the world has evolved, and social media and all of the technical means of communications that exist out there now and how people interact have evolved and changed. So he adapted to that, but at the same time got rid of operations, which was, I don't, stupid isn't quite a strong enough word. It was beyond stupid, but almost. I don't mean traitorous in the legal sense, but almost traitorous in the as to the interests of the national security issues that we're facing, especially today, where it's getting worse, not better, because it's sort of disbanded out. You don't have to just worry about the Soviet Union. Now you've got this array of problems that are out there that you have to be prepared to face, and to disarm ourselves in the intelligence field is just abject stupidity. But what you had was this decades of building experience from OSS through up until John Brennan, where you developed these people, operations officers like myself, who had many overseas tours and a lot of experience and learned from the people that came from before them. And the lessons that were learned were then taught. And it was lessons learned through blood, sweat, and tears, literally. And those lessons have all been flushed down the toilet. Those things aren't taught like they used to be. And there is no operations cadre. They hire people in, they call them operations, but you're now part of these mission centers, which is this big mishmash of everybody just sort of plopped in there. And so anybody can apply for overseas positions. Anybody can go off and get a 2-week course or a 4-week course or whatever, and then they plop them out there. But it's not a career path where you develop the expertise that you need. And you may remember, I'll kind of close out on that aspect, but you may remember Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, who did the first Iraq War. And one of the comments in one of the moments in an interview that he once made was that, and of course he was the commanding general, and he commented on how superb his combat colonels were, and it made his job so easy to win that particular war because of the quality of the combat colonels he had, which is absolutely true. And he made the comment that it takes 20 years to build a fully capable combat colonel. I would echo that precisely. It takes the same amount of time to create a fully capable chief of station who can operate in difficult circumstances overseas. It takes that 20-year path to create that man. The problem now, as I said, with the disbanding of operations as a directorate, you no longer have that pipeline of the 20 years of building that person, and you just draw from any old person, and that it has and is getting people killed, and it has lowered our guard because our capability to collect information that's secret that the other guys don't want us to know is diminished. So it's a horrible thing that has to be turned around, and nobody's even talking about it. The current director, Gina Haspel, who should know better, has done absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So it's a disaster. I'll put it that way.
So you mentioned John Brennan, and John Brennan was the former CIA director back during this Russia collusion case. And I wanted to get into that a little bit. But before we do, can you tell me what the difference is between the FBI and the CIA in terms of the types of work that they do?
Certainly, certainly. The FBI is principally a law enforcement organization, and their law enforcement division is by far the largest within the FBI. They also have a second division, which is the CI, or counterintelligence division, which is where their intelligence activities reside. Now, that traditionally has been more or less divided into two parts, not equal size, but two parts, and that was the FI, or foreign intelligence, which means the collection. Foreigners come to the United States and they're recruited to be reporting assets, or an act of espionage, if you will. They're recruited to report back to the United States. And then there's the CI, which is when foreigners come and they're conducting espionage on our grounds. They're trying to recruit Americans to report to them. So that was traditionally where the FBI resided. And as I said, it's a much smaller division within the FBI, but still a very important and very significant one. That was the position as head of CI that Peter Strzok held, which is, of course, he's very famous with Lisa Page for the text messages going back and forth.
Okay, so now going into this FISA warrant, can you just briefly explain to us what a FISA warrant is and when can it be used?
Sure. Now, FISA warrants are a very interesting thing. These actually developed, FISA came out of the Church Commission, which was back in the 70s, where Frank Church was out of Idaho, and he was a deeply ambitious man and wanted to be president of the United States. And so he was very aggressive in the Church Commission, trying to investigate the CIA, among other things. So one of the offshoots out of that was to try and block who is investigated and looked at closely, so it just isn't run amok where they can just do what they want, which is an interesting turn of events because it's sort of been turned on its ear as this has evolved. But the FISA warrant, or the FISA process, was basically the handshake to take place between intelligence on the one hand and law enforcement on the other. So what happened is, over the years, you'd have a lot of cases where information was developed from foreign sources. For example, just to pick something easy, like a narcotics thing. So collection taking place in Colombia would learn that somebody in Chicago is running large amounts of heroin and cocaine and things like that. So now, since it was intelligence collected, you have to be cautious going into the courtroom, because that would then uncover all of those espionage sources that are taking place. So you had to have a way to pass the baton, if you will, and that was FISA. So the information FISA is really as much, if not more, an intelligence document than it is a legal document, because the origin is intelligence. So it's passed to law enforcement. Law enforcement says, well, we have reason to believe that this guy is doing something and we want to develop our own information on it. So the FISA warrant is approved by a judge. They then have the ability to then go collect on that group I'm just inventing out of Chicago that's involved in narcotics. So once they have the warrant, then it's a clean slate. They start over, but they're looking at somebody specifically, and then they can go after them. Now, that has been kind of evolved and changed and manipulated over time until we get to where we find ourselves today, where it's a problem of blatant corruption. And let me say, there's nothing wrong with the FISA laws. The problem is when you have leadership at the FBI and DOJ be politically corrupt, uh, it can be abused, and that's the problem we have everywhere. If the IRS, the leadership is corrupt, politically corrupt, then they start targeting, say, conservative groups that they view as the opposition. It's that same element playing out. So I'm not sure. I mean, voting, of course, is the cure. I mean, that's how you fix it. You vote the people out. But I kind of the problem that we're facing in today's age is that these people get away with it. And then that does not deter future activities of the same sort. These things can be two-edged swords too. You don't want both groups doing it whenever they get in power. I mean, we'll become a third world country. So me personally, for the good of the United States, we really need to make sure that these investigations are fully carried out, and all of those people who are guilty to whatever degree serve time, go to jail, or whatever punishment there is, whether it be fines or time served or public service, whatever the punishment would be, it needs to be carried out. And that's, of course, why we always put people in jail. It's a deterrence. It's to stop people from doing those same crimes in the future. So it's going to have to play forward that way, or it will repeat.
So I brought up FISA because, of course, I want to talk about the Russia collusion case. And in that case, the FBI and the DOJ went to the FISA court. And FISA means Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I recall in an article that you wrote for the Epoch Times that you said there's a difference between surveillance and spying. And Attorney General Barr had said that he believes they were spying. So can you tell us what the difference is?
Yes, in this case, it's quite clear, a very black and white issue for this sort of thing. And the reason is how it was treated by the FBI. And this shows, again, the political corruption. At the time, this was Peter Strzok, who was in charge of the intelligence division of the FBI. So just take a look. I'll give you two examples so that we can compare them and you can see the clear difference. Dianne Feinstein, who out of a senator from California, has a man that turns out on her staff for 20 years who turns out to be a spy for the Chinese. And what the FBI did was precisely what they're supposed to do. As soon as they discovered that, they went to Dianne Feinstein and said, Dianne, you've got this guy that we now know is a spy for the Chinese on your staff. Now, she fired him, and that unfortunately, it stopped there. And you saw a cover-up begin to take place, which we can go into if you'd like as well. There were a lot of problems with what happened after that. But from the discovery to informing Dianne Feinstein was precisely what is required by regulations. Now, on the other hand, you had President Trump. They supposedly believed, we know this is false now, but they supposedly believed that at the time there was someone on President Trump's campaign staff, Papadopoulos and a couple of others that they were saying might be involved, that they thought or were arguing were working with the Russians, colluding with the Russians from within the campaign. Now they're under the same exact requirements to go to President Trump and say, hey, we suspect that guy is working for the Russians on your campaign. That is surveillance. The moment they made the decision not to inform President Trump, that is spying because Trump didn't know. That is precisely a clear black and white legal difference between those two things. And that's why what they did against Trump was spying. And that's why what they did against Dianne Feinstein was surveillance.
Okay, so let's walk through this then. So we've talked about what a FISA warrant is, and in this investigation, the FBI and the DOJ sought a FISA warrant from the court, but the application that they submitted included something called the Steele dossier, which I'll let you explain in further a little bit later. And this application, the first one was against Carter Page, right? So in terms of intelligence protocols, What is important about about the FBI's first application for the FISA warrant, and why is it important for us to know about what they did?
Sure. Now, of course, the Steele dossier was a political document, and one of the things that's important for anyone listening to understand is everyone knew it was a political document from the very beginning, and the origin of it was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign, and it went forward through lawyers and a couple of, my term would be cutouts. It went through a couple of cutouts, which lawyers' offices are often used this way, so it's not unusual. And it eventually ended up in the hands of a former FBI reporting asset and someone who had cooperated with MI6, the British intelligence. And so that man then was tasked to go get dirt on President Trump. So what he did do, according to the information available on his activities, is one of his activities was he reached out to some probably retired former KGB, SVR is what it's currently called, Russian intelligence officers to get from them whatever their information was on bad stuff that Trump might have done. So that's part of the connection of where the information came from. Now, a very important aspect of that is what happens at that point. Well, you know, from the KGB, I'll use the old term because everyone knows it, but from the Russian intelligence KGB guys, they don't really completely ever retire. So what was the first thing they would have done? They would go to all their active duty guys, and there may have been active duty Russian intelligence guys involved with the Steele dossier. And so what did that create? That created the perfect opportunity for Russian intelligence to plant whatever they wanted in there. So that was, in fact, an act of collusion, but beginning with the Hillary Clinton campaign, going to Steele, who was creating the Steele dossier. Now, out of that, he didn't have any information. Nobody had any information, so he just made it up. And what he did was then tell the Russians, well, give me whatever, you know, make stuff up. So that's what happened. And they gave him all this fictitious stuff. And as I said, the important aspect of that was that everybody knew it was false. Everybody knew it was a political document. But, and here's the rub, the DOJ and the FBI all used it as if it was an intelligence document, something gleaned from intelligence activities. Like myself in the old days, having been a chief of station operations officer, going to one of our foreign assets overseas who's reporting on secrets, conducting espionage at our behest, and collecting that information from him, that then would be an intelligence document. The Steele dossier was absolutely not anything of that nature, but it was presented to the judge, the FISA judge, as if it were an intelligence document. So the problem there is that they attested to that being an intelligence document and true to the best of their knowledge. They all knew it was false. So everybody who signed the FISA warrant, all of them, the senior people at DOJ, they're required to sign it as well as the FBI. And for the 3 subsequent renewals, all of those people probably, there are different ways that could be construed, but would be guilty of, say, something along the lines of perjury. So there's trouble there for those guys. And I've got to say, frankly, I'm a little surprised that FISA court judge hasn't pitched a fit already, knowing that it was a woman in this case. But I'm a little surprised she hasn't pitched a fit, knowing that she was just absolutely lied to, just blatantly lied to. But that is playing out. That is what part of AG Barr, Attorney General Barr, is working on right now. So we'll see how all of that plays out. If those people pay the price for it, then our legal system is working. If they get away with it completely, then we've got problems that we'll have to take care of in the future.
Was it the same judge each time they applied for it?
I believe that that's the process. I don't know if there's any variety in that, and I can't say with 100% certainty, but I believe it goes back to the same judge for renewal.
So if they didn't have the Steele dossier, would they have been able to get the warrant?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, I've read the FISA warrant. Now, it was the redacted version that was made public. We've all read. But I have the advantage of I know what's in that document, and I'm familiar with those sorts of things. So if you look through the part that is unredacted, that tells you what's in the redacted parts, and there's nothing in there. There's no references to some completely different thing. Now, what you've seen, James Clapper, former NSC, and James Comey, former director of FBI, and John Brennan, former director CIA, you've all seen them say, oh, well, there was other things in there and a lot of proof and blah, blah, blah. That's not true. And when that unredacted version is released, it's going to be absolutely clear to everyone that it's just not true. And the politicians that have had greater access to some of these things on the oversight committees and so on, and of course the White House, have made references to that. And very revealing, AG Barr himself said in an interview on Fox News that he went to now director of the FBI, Wray, and said, all right, why did all this get started? What are the reasons? What's the genesis of this whole thing? And his comment in the interview was that he has not received a satisfactory answer. And of course, there's many rumors on the Hill, it's rumint, as we call it, rumor intelligence, that FBI Director Wray and AG Barr have had several kind of heated confrontations over these issues. But absolutely, AG Barr, that confirms absolutely everything I'm saying, because if there had been a lot of other intelligence in that FISA request, it would have been clear, and they would have just set that on the table in front of AG Barr. He would have looked at it and said, okay, this makes sense. But he's clear, absolutely clear on this issue that it does not make sense. And so we know that my reading of the FISA warrant, FISA request, is precisely his reading of it, that it just makes no sense. There is no core reason why any of this began. There is no actual reason that based on law that started it. So if it's not based on law, what's it based on? And I think we all know the answer. It was clearly political. It was politically driven. It was the party in power using its powers to target their political opposition. So I mean, that's go to jail stuff. And as I've said a couple of times now, I mean, we have to put those people in jail. They have to pay the price, because we cannot allow ourselves to be a third world country where this stuff goes on all the time. And we have to have the DOJ and legal system and FBI and IRS and all those things have to function equally and fairly for all Americans.
So speaking of beginnings, it's my understanding that the former CIA director, John Brennan, insisted that this document be used, and he contacted James Comey, who was the former FBI director, right? And Comey complied with this. And I think he communicated with him either through emails or through a phone call. So would you say that this was a treasonous act to submit the false evidence, or you're saying it's just perjury?
Well, I mean, treason is a pretty, it's something pretty significant for someone to have committed. So I sort of hesitate to use treason right off. What you're describing there to me doesn't reach the threshold of treason to me, but
well,
you know,
I'm thinking they're spying on an American citizen. Would that be considered a treasonous act?
No, I don't think so. I think that would be considered criminal. Certainly criminal. I mean, it meets that threshold fairly clearly, and they would need to pay that price. But for me, the treason aspect of it would be sort of hinged on, was he doing it for a foreign power? And I don't think we come near that threshold. I think what John Brennan did was, he was an apparatchik. I mean, he was a party, a guy off the Hill that had been a staffer, had been a chief of staff for a previous director of the CIA. He was a staff party apparatchik, guy. And so that was his perspective, and that was what he was doing. He was being a party loyalist, doing what he could do to help the Democratic Party illegally, but he wasn't helping a foreign power against the United States, which that then would be the treason aspect. With this to me is straight up criminal.
Okay, and what would be the charges? What is the criminal act?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, and I'm not sure exactly how that would play out on the legal aspect of it. But certainly, there's going to be some perjury things of that nature. It's certainly waste, fraud, and abuse would be something that comes to mind for me, because millions and millions of dollars of time and effort were spent on these issues, and it was all made up. So I certainly think those could be brought to bear. But it was creating this document at the behest of the political party to damage the opposition so they would lose the election. And I would be curious to see what all the laws would be that could be applied against it.
So the FBI and the DOJ both knew that Hillary Clinton's campaign had paid for this dossier. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of information to indicate that, to confirm it. Yes. And we've also had like Trey Gowdy came out. By the way, the source of the information on Brennan instructing Comey to use the Steele dossier as the Crown document was given by Trey Gowdy, the former chairman of the Oversight Committee on the House side, when the Republicans had the majority. So he has read those and has said that that's part of the information that's contained, or implied that that's part of the information that's contained. So he's a pretty straightforward guy, and also an attorney, and was also a prosecutor. So I think his perspective is worthy of a lot of respect on this. So also, Crown document, that's kind of a revealing comment, because where John Brennan came from was analysis. He was an analyst, and that's a term that you would hear analysts use. It's the Crown document from which everything else flows. And if you take it away, it just reduces everything else to kind of rubble. It's just supporting evidence that goes to nothing. So you need that Crown document, if you will, to have everything else make sense. That would be the analyst sort of take on that. So it all makes sense. I'm convinced that all of that is exactly right, and that it was in fact John Brennan who pushed Comey to make sure that that document was included in his brief to the president, so that then James Clapper could then go to the press and bring all this out as a news item, something reportable.
So 2 questions. Do you think that the FBI and the DOJ should have let the FISA court know that the Clinton campaign had paid for this dossier? And also, do you think that a counterintelligence investigation should have been opened up against the Clinton campaign?
Well, on the first one, it's actually a requirement by law. They're required to say the truth of what they know about the origin of the document. So it's not a thing of opinion. It's a thing that's actually in the law. So they were required to report everything they knew about the document and did not. Therefore, the perjury or fraud of some sort would apply in that case. On the CIA investigation of Hillary Clinton, I don't know that I think in her case, probably criminal investigation would have been more appropriate than CI. I don't think what she was doing, again, was something related to her betraying the United States to a foreign power per se. There's a lot of questions I have about some of the deals that were made when she was Secretary of State, and the money that went into the Clinton Foundation that they invented, and to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and some of the speaking fees that Bill Clinton got, and those sorts of things. Those would need to be investigated, but that's more criminal by nature. And I would point out now, absolute, again, black and white, where this clearly indicates a real problem with corruption, is the Anthony Weiner laptop. There were 2 phases to this, if you will. There were the WikiLeaks emails that all originated from Hillary Clinton, within which there were a lot of classified documents. You had the Anthony Weiner laptop, which everyone knows he was the husband of Uma, who was the assistant to Hillary Clinton. On his laptop, they found thousands. That's one of the things that James Comey brought up in his speech, where he basically vindicated Hillary Clinton and said no one would prosecute her based on these things. But if you read closely what he said, he implied there were roughly 2,500 to 3,000 classified emails on that, including CIA documents. The IG then inspected this. The FBI agent out in Seattle, Washington, who had collected up this laptop and was looking for child pornography and things like that to use against Anthony Weiner in court, looked at all of that, and he didn't have a clearance, so he was very uncomfortable having all of this. But his comment to the FBI IG was that James Comey was disingenuous with the American people talking about that, and that he was off by at least a factor of 10 as to how many classified documents were on that. Well, now we're talking no longer 2,500 to 3,000. Now we're talking 25,000 to 30,000. That computer later went to Quantico, where now they're talking numbers of 50 to 70,000 classified documents on that computer. So we're talking tens of thousands of classified documents, some of which we know are CIA, some of which we know are NSA. Clearly, there's State Department classified documents in that. Who knows what harm was done during that period, because it hasn't been investigated. There has been no damage assessment done on all of those classified documents, so that we know what did the Chinese get out of it, what did the Russians get out of it, what did the Iranians get out of it. And yet, during that same period of time, according to press reporting, the Chinese intelligence activities inside China, that is to say, the CIA's recruited Chinese assets in China, reporting on China to us. All of those guys were wrapped up. 19 people at least were shot by firing squad, and another handful arrested and perhaps later shot by firing squad. An Iranian official who was a high-level person in the missile program, the Iranian missile program, high interest to us, he was shot as a spy. So these things are out there. We don't know. I mean, I can't say it did happen or didn't happen. We don't know why those guys got caught. But certainly, this has to be one of the clear possibilities as to how those people got caught. Now, going again back to that Anthony Weiner laptop, that is very much like somebody walking into their living room at home. They find a dead body on the floor, 3 bullet holes to the head. You look at it and go, okay, we know this is not suicide. We know this is a murder crime. We don't know who did it. We don't have somebody standing over the body with a gun, but you know that's a crime. Same thing with this Anthony Weiner laptop. Every single one of those classified documents, of which there's tens of thousands of them on his laptop, every one of those is individually a crime. And nothing has been done. Anthony Weiner's not in any trouble over that. He's not being investigated for it that we know of. Maybe AG Barr is now taking a look at that. But clearly, black and white, obvious crime to the tens of thousands, and nothing's been done. Why? A clear indicator, again, black and white, of high-level DOJ, FBI corruption. You're not enforcing these crimes anymore. Dead bodies with 3 bullet holes in the living room floor is, there's no there. We're not investigating it. It's just clear political corruption. So I don't even know. I mean, it may be so bad that a lot of that cannot be fixed. I'm not sure the FBI is fixable, because that whole pipeline of everybody that's there, not all rank and file, but the pipeline to leadership in the senior positions are all of that type that are willing to allow this sort of political corruption. So it's a real problem. And by the way, I'm not suggesting the FBI is alone. I mean, I would certainly include NSA, CIA, and most assuredly, I'm sure no one is surprised to hear that about the IRS. So it's a real serious problem. And how do you step in and fix it? Because it's not really fixable with who's there. So what do you do? This is a real problem that we're facing.
Well, speaking of classified documents, so President Trump has announced that he's declassifying the FISA documents and several other documents that were submitted with that. So other than the obvious misuse of the dossier, what other information may be contained in those declassified documents?
Well, I don't think there's going to be too much in that first wave. Now, I'll say, here in the Washington, D.C. area, everybody knows what's coming. I mean, there's no confusion as to what's unfolding as we speak. The things that you described with the FISA warrant being declassified and so on, everybody's known that's been coming for a long time. Once it's out, it's going to be precisely what I said it was. It's going to be clear. They'll make reference to everything, but as John Brennan is reported to have said, the Steele dossier was the Crown document. There is nothing else significant if you remove that from the equation. And so that's the underlying problem. Once that comes out, that's, it's a nail in the coffin of the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party loyalists within government circles. How do you excuse that? How do you explain it? Then will those people be in legal jeopardy over those things? And I think the answer is clearly yes on that aspect of it. And a guy like Barr, I wasn't sure what to think of him when he got nominated, but now that I've seen him in action and heard what he said, I think he truly believes in the legal system of the United States and wants to bring the FBI and DOJ back to the level where it's a trusted government agency. And he sees the danger of what has happened playing out into the future. So I think he's genuinely going to try and actually enforce the laws on this. So, but this is not a thing. Now, again, I wasn't sure what to think of President Trump either when he first got elected. But I mean, let's face it. How has he handled the press all along? And he'll do something out here that's kind of outrageous according to the press, and they'll go ballistic on it. While over here, President Trump is doing what he wants to do. So I mean, he's played them like a violin. So I have no doubt whatsoever. I have 100% confidence in the president's capability to play this to his advantage in dealing with the press. So I think there's zero question that this is just the first wave, and so you want to do one blockbuster at a time and then go to the next one and then to the next one and so on. And I think we're going to see a steady drumbeat beginning with the FISA warrant being released and some supporting document around it, That's bomb number one. And then we'll move down the line and he's going to start having bomb after bomb every month, every 2 months, something like that, right up until 2020 elections. So that, I think you can gauge how much he's holding on to based on when he's beginning, so that every month or two from now on until elections, we're just going to see this stuff hit. So it's, as I was saying earlier too, one reference to this, the Democrats all know what's there. They all know what's coming. And this is why you see people like Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House currently for the Democrats. She doesn't like this. Now, she was always sort of a separate fiefdom, if you will, within the Democratic Party from the White House. She was sort of her own power base during the Obama years when all this was taking place. So she kind of used her rice bowl or her fiefdom as hers as Speaker. So that's why you see her take the role she's taken, where she's saying, well, I don't know if impeachment is the right way forward. We shouldn't be doing it. To the Democrats, she's saying things like, what if we lose? If we lose, then he's clear and we're screwed for 2020. We don't want to do it. It's not in our best interest. And publicly, she's saying things like, look, until we can get the degree of proof that would be required to convince the Republicans in the Senate, until we get that, there's no use going forward, because it'll be DOA, dead on arrival, in the Senate, and it has to be the Senate to pass the impeachment. So she's all out arguing against all of this, because she knows if they continue doubling down, all the information's coming out showing that all that stuff was false, and she'll be burned in it. So Nancy Pelosi's pedaling as fast as she can in every way, and that follows all the other ways. You've seen, for example, now you've seen John Brennan and James Comey kind of go head to head. They're pointing fingers at each other. You saw John Brennan kind of bring James Clapper under his wing a little bit, trying to keep him close. Because, and all three of those people were very good friends. They went out to dinner with each other and their wives and so on. So they're close associates and friends. So like I said, everybody there knows what's happening. And so that's why you see the Democratic Party. They believe that their only defense is a very strong offense. And that's only a faction. But those are the guys out there screaming to impeach. There are probably some who don't really understand the full picture, but the guys that have been around all do. And so they're the ones at the core of this group screaming impeachment, so that when this data comes out showing their illegal behavior, they can say, well, that's political. You're the ones that are guilty. You're only saying that because we're going after you. They're building in their defense now. And I guarantee you, that's what the Democratic cry will be as each of these things gets popped out into the public arena. They're going to say, well, it's political. You're only doing it because we're doing it. And that's the behavior you'll see. But like I said, they've got real legal problems if the laws are enforced.
Well, President Trump has said that there are going to be FISA documents released, and he says, and more. So,
yes.
Yeah, and you said there's not much with the FISA warrant, but what other documents could he be referring to?
No, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think he'll dilute the importance of the release of the FISA document with huge dumps of unrelated material. So I think there won't be tremendous amounts with the first dump of information that's declassified. I think there's huge amounts of information out there that will be released and declassified, but bit at a time. So I like I said, that first just group of documents will be sort of related to one issue. You'll see the next group of documents come out later. But no, I think there's reams and reams of information that's going to be released and declassified, some perhaps redacted, some not, that's going to show some real serious problems. And, these emails and the text messages and all of those things, these emails we know they're there. Trey Gowdy said they're there. There's those things between the conversations between John Brennan and James Comey. Well, those will come out later too. Those are interesting. It makes no sense to release them with the FISA warrant. Also, let's not forget Papadopoulos, who is one of the guys targeted in a combined operation between British intelligence, Italian intelligence, the CIA, the FBI, and also the related law enforcement organizations in the UK and Italy, targeted Papadopoulos. Now, again, while Papadopoulos was giving testimony, one of the things he commented on is the people on the oversight committee that were asking him questions had clearly read transcripts of all this stuff. So those are all out there too. Nobody's talking about that too much, but all that's going to come out. And like I said, the one phone call Trump made to the prime minister of Italy and those 6 high-level intelligence guys in Italy were all sacked like that. they were all gone the next day. I mean, we all know what's coming. We know what's out there. We see this coming, but all that is going to be released. And like I said, it'll be bombshell at a time. So the first bombshell, like I said, I don't think will contain very much unrelated to the FISA warrant. There may be an occasional thing thrown in there. They might be setting the groundwork for future releases by releasing certain documents up front. But I think it's going to be done in a studied, effective manner. And that studied, effective manner isn't put everything out there now when elections are still well down the road. They need a steady drumbeat. And as I say, Trump really knows how to handle the press well. I mean, no president has ever stood up of any party under attack like he has and handled himself so well. I mean, whether you like him or hate him, you have to recognize talent when you see it. I don't particularly like ballet, but you see somebody really good doing it that can leap, 15 feet into the air or 12, whatever it is that they do. You got to look at that and go, well, there's talent there. And then you just have to recognize that within Trump. He's a very talented man. He's not a stupid man like a lot of people like to imply. Maybe he's a little bit on the crude side, as people often say, but nevertheless, intelligent this between now and 2020 November elections.
Okay, so now let's talk about the Inspector General's report. He's focusing on investigating the Steele dossier. Has that report come out yet?
No, it was supposed to come out this month. They were talking about it coming out in early June. Now, here's an interesting thing. It's the man that he's appointed to lead that investigation, I believe, is John Durham. He is somebody who's been very active in this sort of thing before, not afraid to let the evidence take the story wherever it does. And some of what's gone on, it's sort of the Washington, D.C. insider aspect of it, if you will. That report was supposed to come out in early June, sometime around now or before. And instead, what happened is they have expanded the investigation. They have rented new offices. And this is how this information goes out. That office that's doing this investigation rented new space, brought in new lawyers, and increased their budget. So, and the reason now, there was a public comment made to that effect, the reason they've done that is because the amount of information that's come to their attention is expanding at such a rate that they just can't handle it with who they have. So they were then saying, well, the end of the month, maybe something like that. But I hate to go too far out on a limb, but I'm telling you right now, the end of the month, that's not going to be done. They just, within the last couple of weeks, have hired a bunch of lawyers and expanded their office space to handle the volume of information they've uncovered. So I would be surprised if we really get anything within the next 60 days. I think somewhere about that time, those guys will have had just kind of being experienced in stuff. It's not something that's done in a week. You need a month or two to kind of dig in and follow it through and question people. And you got to make appointments to talk to these guys. You got to get copies of the documents and sit down and read them carefully and study them and see if that takes you to the next document. So it just takes, a month or two to go kind of dig through all of that. And if they uncover more, well, they'll rent more office space and hire more lawyers and keep digging into it. So we'll see how quickly it comes out. My prediction, 60 days at best. But, it's hard to predict those things.
Well, my understanding is the Inspector General report, he's limited in what he can do. He can't really he can't go out and get interviews or force people to, or subpoena people. But, and also the Attorney General's office has to wait until they get the Inspector General's report before they can go forward. Is that your understanding?
Yeah,
they're doing it together.
Well, I mean, the inner workings there, I don't think I could tell you, but I would put it this way. There are a lot of people involved with these things that don't like what they see. There's a lot of pushback. Now, just again, people that I know, former federal government employees, FBI, and people like that among the lawyer circles involved. There's a lot of people that don't like what they see. And you've seen, for example, noteworthy Democrats that come out and look at this whole thing and go, well, wait a minute, you're not following the laws even to do this. And this is not good for the country. They take an actual even-handed, non-political look at this and look at the dangers. So there are a group of people like that. And there are a group of people that hated it from the beginning and knew it was wrong, but yet have information on it. And they're perfectly capable. Now, you may not be able to force them to testify, but a lot of those people are going to volunteer the information. So I don't think they're required not to accept information that's willingly provided to them. So as they are looking for documents and so on, and if someone gives it to them, it's go, by the way, this and this and this and this about this document, they'll willingly accept that. So I think that's part of the reason why you're starting to see some of the expansion, just because this thing has grown out. Now, how that is handled internally by the DOJ, I really am not the person to be able to speak to that authoritatively.
Okay. Another thing, I don't know if you can speak to this either, but the Inspector General apparently wanted to interview Christopher Steele, who's the author of the dossier. And Steele initially refused, but then later it was reported that he said he would agree to the interview if certain conditions were met. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, I am.
So
Everybody
what?
wants to talk to Steele, and Congress has asked him to come testify as well, and he's refused. Uh, I'm not. Steele is not a U.S. citizen, unless I'm completely mistaken. But there's been no reporting to that fact. If it's true, I believe he's a British citizen. So he's unless he's extradited, which I would consider probably very unlikely. He'd have to be charged with the crime to have that happen. And I'm not sure Christopher Steele did anything illegal. I mean, he was paid to go dig up dirt. He dug up dirt and gave it to him, and what they do with it is their problem, not his. So I think his problem at this point is, if he comes in and starts testifying and talking, he'll essentially make himself what we can all kind of generically call a snitch. And in his world that he's operating in, then he's destroyed. He'll never work in any town again anywhere because it's such a famous case. So I think he's a little bit caught between a rock and a hard place, because his testimony is going to make a lot of people involved from the lawyer's office originating with the Clinton campaign. It's going to make them all look bad. So and I think he philosophically is a leftist. So he's in agreement with all of these things. So I don't think he wants to, and I think he'll damage himself reputationally to do so. So I think he's resisting greatly and trying to figure out some sort of way to walk the razor's edge and try to give what he, the minimum he can give without having to get in and tell the whole story. So I don't think in the scheme of things he's all that important, but it would be helpful to have his testimony. And certainly that's why people are after him, because he's a public aspect of this that can then be used to generate further investigation into other things. But Steele himself, he was no great operator or anything like that. And that's why he ended up doing what he was doing. That was why he was in that world. He was kind of digging dirt for the political guys, not a high level intelligence operative type guy.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think part of the conditions was that they would have to go to the UK in order to interview him. And then once they got there were some other conditions that would have to be met. So he's making it really difficult for them to actually interview him.
Yes.
But is there anything else that you'd like to tell our listeners that you haven't had an opportunity to say so far in this interview?
Well, I have to say, I just as me kind of a intelligence operative guy looking at this whole situation unfold. I mean, we're in what the Chinese always refer to as living in interesting times, and I think that's what we're seeing. But I believe, and as I said, I was not initially a Trump supporter, although I am a conservative myself personally. I was not a Trump supporter when all this kicked off, but as I've watched this unfold and see what he does, and if you look closely at the promises he's made, like as to, for example, the list of people that he was going to suggest for the Supreme Court nominees, if any positions came open for him, he's stuck to that. And if you look, it's very rare to have a politician kind of keep his word on things. So while we're living in these interesting times, it's a very, very dangerous period of time. There's just no question. There are a lot of storm clouds on the horizon. There's a lot of things that resemble what we were in leading into World War I. Out of World War I not being satisfactorily completed, we got World War II. I mean, a lot of people argue, as would I, that World War II is a continuation of World War I. And there are a lot of similarities where a very small spark, a Duke Ferdinand being shot in the streets in Sarajevo, which in today's Bosnia, was the spark that started off this enormous World War I. And I think we're in a similar situation where a relatively small spark could start a much larger problem. And we've seen a lot of fighting that wants to take place around the world. I mentioned Bosnia. The fighting's not done in Bosnia, and the solution that was imposed on it was political, not practical. And what we're seeing in the Middle East, there's a lot of tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the different groups that have kind of faced off against each other with the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, you've got India and Pakistan and all of these areas that it would not take much to ignite. So we're in a period of real, conceivably real danger of a much, much, much larger problem taking place. And I think, fortunately, we actually have a president, oddly enough, who is kind of facing all of that stuff and reducing the level of danger. Well, he gets criticized for the things he does, but I've become a real believer in his capability and why he's going about the things he's doing. So I would leave all of your viewers with that thought in mind. This is a dangerous period, but it looks like by some bizarre twist of fate, kind of a serendipitous way that it unfolded for us, that we have a president that's going to help reduce those dangers. So I'm optimistic in the scheme of things as we sit.
Well, I certainly appreciate you coming to America Daily, giving us your point of view from a former CIA officer's point of view. I think that we appreciate all the comments that you've made here today, and thank you so much for joining America Daily.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure. I hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.